how Adam Smith and other Scots originated a political meaning for liberal and launched liberalism. This is joint work with a George Mason University undergraduate student, Will Fleming. There's another person involved that we're consulting with that might also become a co-author. Sometimes semantic issues are not very important. Coriander, cilantro, whatever. But if people started talking this way, not having showered for a week, he was rather Swedish, you might think of it as more than a mere semantic issue. When semantic issues concern words that are central to the structure of the web of our knowledge, it becomes important. And no words have been more central to the structure of the web of our knowledge than these words in modern civilization. And unfortunately, all these words lost meaning, particularly from 1880 on. I'd say particularly from 1880 to 1840 was the big transformation period. And I feel that basically we've never really recovered the ascendant meanings of these words up till 1880. So in other words, the vocabulary of the liberal era really is in a state of confusion. When words lose their meaning, people lose their liberty, said Confucius, who was quoted by Hayek. And it's probably nowhere worse than in the US, where people like Paul Krugman or the television commentator Rachel Maddow call themselves liberal. And furthermore, they are called liberal by people like Jonah Goldberg and Sean Hannity. So you've got two sides confirming and reinforcing some of this way of speaking, which I know to you as Swedes is not the way you're used to doing it, but I know you're aware of this whole issue. And this is, of course, really sort of code in the US for Republican and Democrat. And one chooses whether to talk that way and to think that way, and of course a lot of Americans fall into talking that way and thinking that way, and you can choose that. Or you could perhaps talk the way they talk and think the way they think. These would be many of the classical liberals of the last couple centuries. And then here are some Scandinavian ones. And for them, is liberal a lost cause? Maybe, maybe not. Recovering liberal might depend on uncovering its original political meaning. It might depend on the character also of its originators, if they're particularly good exemplars. Now, the word liberal is old. This is an engram. And this single word here, actually either in lowercase l or capital L in this case, it's showing the percentage of words in millions of scanned books by Google that are the word liberal. So that's what's on the horizontal axis, is the percentage of the words that are liberal, that are the word liberal. And you can see that this is up to 1760. It's an old word. The words had pre-political uses for centuries and centuries. This distinction between pre-political uses of liberal and political uses is made by this German historian, Jorn Leonhard, who wrote this award-winning book about liberalism. And we follow him in distinguishing these two kinds of uses of the word liberal, the pre-political, which we're not so interested in actually, and then the political, okay? And in that, I follow him, but not in other things. Now, here's an idea of the pre-political. This is a facsimile reproduction from Samuel Johnson's dictionary of 1755. Liberal, not mean, not low in birth, not low in mind, becoming a gentleman, munificent, generous, bountiful, not parsimonious. So you see a lot of this sort of generous in of course, all along. And in fact, in the English language, it's only the pre-political, pretty much. And here's up to this point. Now, this is a neat result where the tools developed by Mark Davies, a linguistics professor at Brigham Young, who we've been in consultation with and who might in fact become a co-author of this paper. He's developed tools which allow you to show the collocate nouns. Liberal's an adjective, but he's developed the tools to show you what that adjective is modifying, what noun that adjective is modifying. And what we see here is all nouns: education, arts with a capital A, sciences, hand, rewarder, kind, heir, endowments, mind, way, encouragement, and so on. They're all pre-political. None of them are political in English to 1769. So where did the political come from? Who started it? Well, Leonhard has some thoughts on this. He says, a new political meaning was imported, that is to say, imported to Britain from the continent in response to the consequences of the French Revolution. He speaks of liberal being coined by the French Revolution and Napoleon. He says already at the beginning of the 1820s, it became clear that liberal was coined, in English that is, in regards to the Greek and Spanish movements of the 1810s and 20s. After 1815, he says, the semantic transformation of the adjective liberal from an un-English adjective with revolutionary implications into an integral concept of the English political language took place. I don't agree with this. The changing atmosphere of public opinion, that is to say in Britain, now considered an important factor in the political life of the nation, was reflected by the slow adaptation of the imported concept liberal. And then he goes even further and talks about Brougham. He says that because for him in 1827, as for other Edinburgh reviewers, liberal no longer implied a revolutionary tone in politics. It was now not only possible for the Whig reformers to apply the term when speaking of a new political concept, but also to use it as a self-indication. So Leonhard is saying that that it originated on the continent. He talks about the French Revolution and Napoleon, and then being imported by the Brits. Now, as it turns out, this thesis, which I call the importation thesis, has quite a long history. And there's recent scholars, which I list above, this is going in backwards history, reverse chronology, who also have used the term imported and say things like this. And it's in textbooks, and it's in this history of liberalism. It's implied by this piece on liberalism, and then it goes back even earlier, and in fact, it may originate with this article in 1823 from the Tory journal, Blackwood's. So it's got a history, but this thesis has been doubted by others. This fellow, who some of you surely recognize, Friedrich Hayek, said, it is often suggested that the term liberal derived from the early 19th century Spanish party of the liberales. I am more inclined to believe that it derives from the use of the term by Adam Smith in such passages as, and then he gives a couple of Smith's uses. So which is it, Hayek's thesis or the importation thesis? We can now resolve this matter thanks to massive digitization and the tools. We can establish the original or inceptive political meaning of liberal. And our finding is basically that Hayek is right, and that the importation thesis is basically wrong. It does, however, instruct us in certain respects, perhaps, but basically it's wrong. So I want to basically lay this out for you and show you the evidence, talk a little bit about the significance. This you've already seen. None of the collocates here up to 1769 are sort of political ones. But look what happens in 1769. Here we use the political nouns so that we get these political expressions: liberal system, liberal principles, liberal plan, liberal views, liberal ideas. See, that's not generous. That's not the old or liberal arts. That's not what's going on here. This is liberal as more accustomed to thinking about it in political terms. Look at this. Look how it is when I showed Mark Davies this big data linguist, he was like, there's something going on there. That is remarkable. And this picture is a good portion of really all I have to say. I mean, I go further, but it starts in about 1769 and it continues and it grows. And all of these political terms, political expressions are growing. Now, I bring this picture up here until about 1828. Do these keep growing after 1828? Actually, they don't. They kind of level off and even decline. Can anyone guess why that would be? What substitute arises? No. For these. Liberalism. Liberalism gets born, okay? An ism, which doesn't come really until the 1820s or so. And that obviously serves for a lot of these terms, and so it starts mopping up a lot of the usage, okay? So I want to go back to that 1769 and in a way ask, why did the classical liberal philosophy adopt the word liberal in the first place, and who originated it? Well, here basically are the chief answers. William Robertson and Adam Smith. Let me tell you a little bit about William Robertson. I doubt that any of you have heard of him. He's not much known now. He was a historian at the University of Edinburgh. He was actually a very big deal in his day in two important respects. First of all, he was a huge institutional player in his day, both in the University of Edinburgh and as a leader in the Church of Scotland, okay, being a minister and being someone on the General Assembly or whatever it was called, and being a real big player that way. But he was also really famous as a historian, and a couple of his books were huge monumental successes and very important in the whole Scottish Enlightenment and some of the core themes of the Scottish Enlightenment. Anyway, I've got a bunch of quotations here. I'm not going to try to impart them and show you the signal significance of this liberal usage, these usages. Most important is his 1769 work on basically the first half of the 16th century, when Emperor Charles V reigned as the Holy Roman Emperor. It's not that he thinks that guy was so liberal or something. He's like telling a broader story, kind of a progress story, kind of a providence story, actually, where liberalism and liberal ideas, as it were, emerged through the creation of a balance of power among independent states, which then gravitate towards more liberal policies and liberal ideas thereafter. He's very much got a kind of Whig progress notion, which a lot of the Scottish Enlightenment had. Anyway, he starts using this word liberal this way. And it seems to us from the powerful research we can do with these tools, that he's really quite original in this. And I don't know exactly where he got the idea, but he's doing it. And these are some of the prime samples, but there's more. There's many more. And he was a friend of Smith's. In a letter to Smith's, he even denounces certain arrangements as illiberal, as though it's like a term that's bubbling up among this society, or this circle. And he's very respectful towards Smith. He's complimenting him on The Wealth of Nations, which Robertson's just read. And he ends, "I shall often follow you as my guide and instructor." A very big compliment. He was actually, as you see here, a little older, 2 years older than Smith. So it's not like he's a junior to Smith. I'll spend a little bit more time. Oh, and let me first say that it appears Robertson attended Smith's Edinburgh lectures earlier, before his major works, and there is definite evidence that Smith felt that Robertson had borrowed certain things from Smith's lectures. And those borrowed themes do relate to this whole sort of liberal narrative and liberalism generally, without question. However, liberal is not used in the political sense in the student transcriptions of those lectures, or we don't really know exactly how much those lectures correspond to these transcriptions, but liberal's not in the jurisprudence or the lecture notes, or for that matter, the rhetoric ones. And so there's no smoking gun here by any means that Smith started liberal, and then in the lectures, and then Robertson picked up on it. It doesn't appear in Smith until The Wealth of Nations in 1776, so Robertson appears to be the first, and Smith may well have followed his innovation. And based on the record, I think that's probably the presumption you should give to Robertson. Okay? Now, when Smith picks up on it quickly and in a significant way, that's really important to tell in the story, just because Smith's such a big deal. Smith's hugely influential and continues to be influential, whereas Robertson fades. So I have some samples here. Again, I'm not going to try to impart these, but here, let me start where were all nations to follow the liberal system of free exportation and importation, the different states into which a great continent, such as Europe, was divided, would so far resemble the different provinces of a great empire. So he's got this incredibly cosmopolitan vision of all of Europe trading freely with each other, and now it's as though it's one great empire where they're of fellows. Okay, so it's a very cosmopolitan view, the liberal system. And then he talks about the benefits of that, but very few countries have entirely adopted this liberal system. He's reinforcing this term, liberal system, right there in the same paragraph. I think that's very signal in that he's putting this word, liberal, as a label on what he's got in mind. And it's not just international trade. It's not just trade across national boundaries. This is, again, I think, a very important passage where first he's talking about Colbert, the finance minister, or the famous minister in France. The industry and commerce of a great country, Colbert endeavored to regulate upon the same model as the departments of a public office. This is to say he tried to manage the national economy as an organization. And instead of allowing every man to pursue his own interests his own way, upon the liberal plan of equality, liberty, and justice, he bestowed certain branches of industry or extraordinary privileges, while he laid others under as extraordinary restraints. It's a very important contrast he's creating there, the kind of organizational, dirigiste view versus the liberal plan. Okay, so again, I think this is a quite signal use of the word liberal. He talks about the physiocrats having a liberal and generous system. Again, the physiocrats, in representing perfect liberty as the only effectual expedient for rendering this annual reproduction the greatest possible, its doctrine seems to be in every respect as just as it is generous and liberal. He talks about this with respect to individual professions in the labor market and how they should proceed upon liberal principles. So it's not just international trade. When he tells his story, when he talks about the rise of sort of modern Europe from the breakdown of the Roman Empire in Book 3 of The Wealth of Nations, he's got this story basically about the king granting more and more freedoms to the towns. And he says through this process, the burghers, the townspeople, became really free in our present sense of the word freedom. And he capitalizes freedom. And then he says that the princes who lived upon the worst terms with their barons or lords seem accordingly to have been the most liberal in grants of this kind to their burghs or towns. So here again, he's got this narrative. This is actually very parallel to Robertson. This is actually what Smith felt Robertson stole, actually, or it's the main part of it, about the rise of freedom through and associating it again with liberal. Okay. And Smith gets picked up on, it seems, or Smith and Robertson, right in British officialdom. I mean, it's not some obscure scholarly text on page 653 of some fat book people perhaps didn't read. The king uses this term in the opening of Parliament in 1782. And other people in Parliament did. Many did. And so what we see is a continuity in the British. And gosh, Wealth of Nations, this is going back to contrasting to what Leonhard said about it starting in the continent and being imported later in Britain. It's in the Wealth of Nations. And that was published 23 years prior to when Bonaparte apparently first uttered this idea of liberal ideas, and 34 years before the Spanish liberales. Okay? Now, I just want to move ahead quickly with some stuff in Britain, and then jump to Europe, and then jump back to Britain. Here is the same kind of picture with the collocates, but this is 30 years forward now from 1770 to 1799. And here what you see, now policy, which was 0 before, is up to 3%. I think principles is up to 2%. And from 0, that's a big rise. And so it's starting. It's catching on, just like the other picture showed. And here, policy is now up to 5% of the collocates with liberal, and the other ones, principles, views, are gaining ground. Here's another way of showing this. Here we did it by decades, and this was the collocates among the top 100 collocates by decade. So there's actually just a point for each 10-year period here. It starts, like we said, basically here. This is a little start, and it keeps growing. I mean, it's not as though it's a flash in the pan that dies out and then somehow gets re-imported again from. Rather, there's continuity. So after 1776, the Scots kept the liberal ball rolling, and it was particularly the Scots, and in fact, the folks of Edinburgh. There was no drying up and then importation. Now, before continuing with Edinburgh, let's go to Europe. Okay, here's when did they begin to talk liberal in a political sense? And fortunately for 4 of these languages, there are corpora at Google, although not for Swedish. Oh, by the way, there's a handout. Do you guys have that access? That's about the Swedish story. Well, these are the same liberal terms, but in French. They catch on, they get started, but gosh, it's in the 1790s that it begins. Remember, the Brits are starting from here, right? And then continuing. So the French are trailing the Brits here with political liberal talk. Spain, the same thing. Italy, the same thing. Germany, the same thing. The first people to talk political liberal were the Scots. The Brits did not import liberal. Rather, it seems that they exported it to Europe, that the Europeans imported liberals from the Brits, and especially the Scots. These works were early translated in a lot of cases, certainly sometime before, Leonhard and the others talk about the first years of the 19th century. Moreover, folks in these countries, would often read the English as well. The French translations are perhaps particularly important because I think a lot of the folks in Spain and Italy would read the French. So just let's look a little bit for evidence of the European country or the continental country actually importing from Britain. Again, in France, there's early translations of the key works we see starting this ball, with Wealth of Nations being the most important one. Smith himself was in France and had friends in France, as was his good friend David Hume, leading up to this whole thing. The French certainly engaged Smith directly from the English. Jean-Baptiste Say is editing a periodical, which is described here as one in which he expounded the doctrines of Adam Smith. This is from 1794 to 1800. And then his Principles, a very liberal, very Smithian work, his major work, appears in 1803. Again, before the time that Leonhard and the others are talking about the Brits getting it from the Europeans. This fellow in Spain, Jovellanos, perhaps, he was a very influential guy, very respected guy. I don't know a lot about this. I don't know a lot about a lot of these things. It's kind of leading me into all these strange places, but I find out kind of what the main thing I need to know. Anyway, it's this scholar says that though his liberalism was not the product of a single influence, Smith impressed him profoundly. And there's tons of evidence for that. In fact, he kept diaries about reading and rereading The Wealth of Nations. He also, by the way, read Robertson's chief work in this matter. He was one of the leaders of the Spanish liberales. So he's clearly picking up this liberal from the Scots and from those sources. So rather than the Spanish liberales giving it to the Brits, it's clearly the Spanish liberales, or I think pretty clearly, getting it from Smith and the others. Now the handout concerns particularly this fellow, who I've learned a little bit about just from the translations that Lotte did of that book. This guy is amazing. I mean, someone should make a movie about this guy. He was like the king's general, and then when he saw how crazy the king was, oh hi Lars, he said, forget this, and we're going to go towards something else, and he led this peaceful revolution, as I understand it. And there was different flanks in the convention, and one of the two flanks is called the liberal flank. He himself called a liberal as early as this. Meanwhile, he's a huge Smith fan, having translated parts of The Wealth of Nations. So, again, it's a clear case of Europeans, that is to say non-Brits in Europe, picking up on the Scottish liberalism or the British liberalism and carrying the ball, or more basically importing it. Now, all of this business between the continent and Britain, I think, is really important in understanding what's in liberalism and the vying meanings that have continued even down to today, and in fact where the left liberalism kind of draws from in that tradition. On the continent, where like these people are doing revolutions, reconstitutions, maybe even making nations in Italy or in Germany, and so on, there's sort of a two-step thinking if you're a classical liberal. First, you need to make a change in the governance or constitution to overcome the illiberals who are in power, the old regime if you like, and to get liberals into power. And then step two would be to institute liberal reform in this sort of Adam Smith natural liberty sense of the term. Step one requires a coalition. You know, it could even be a revolution. And that could very much compromise step two. You got to appeal to all these people to make this, as it were, constitutional or political change. So this, in some ways, dilutes this, I think, in the continent. Even when the guys spearheading it are like it seems like Adla Spara and the other guy in Spain are strong Smithian liberals. They're bound to be kind of compromised by step two. Now, Britain's different. It's a place of exceptionally stable government, and it's an island, which also helps a lot and is part of that stability. And so the British liberal authors are more focused on step two. And this difference is part of like what Hayek sees as the difference between the British liberal tradition and the Continental, and maybe particularly French, he might say, tradition. It ties into all that. So that's one reason why I think this investigation is interesting. Now I just want to finish by picking up on Scotland, and after Adam Smith, it doesn't end there. Liberalism itself the word liberalism doesn't come still till like the 1820s, and the Liberal Party in Britain doesn't get into power until the 1860s even. This guy's very important. Phillipson says here, at Edinburgh, he lectured on the principles of government and political economy to an influential group of students who were to do much to form Whig and Tory opinion in the early 19th century, and especially Whig. This historian of thought said, in advocating liberty of individual enterprise and unrestricted exchange of the products of personal or national industry, he goes farther even than his master, that is to say, Adam Smith. He was also actually a big student of Thomas Reid, and in that way he's actually a little bit of a difference, and I would even say a departure from the Hume-Smith line of the Scottish Enlightenment. That kind of gets into some other things, but I'm not altogether happy about Dugald Stewart. But in this respect, it doesn't really matter. This author says this about Stewart. He served as the intellectual bridge between the Scottish Enlightenment and the Victorian age. Through Stewart, the Scottish philosophy touched nearly every aspect of public life in Britain. For Stewart was not just a revered teacher, he was also a great synthesizer and organizer who put the disparate works of the Scottish school together as a system, the foundation for what we call classical liberalism. And then this is about his influence. This is from the 1911 Encyclopedia Britannica. He succeeded to the chair. He was the teacher. Young men were attracted from England and from the continent, even America. People came to study with him. Among his pupils, and these guys are all Scots, I believe, were Sir Walter Scott, the famous novelist, Francis Jeffrey, who becomes the editor of the Edinburgh Review, Cockburn, another big famous guy, Francis Horner. All these guys are really important. And in politics and in opinion, you see James Mill there. He's originally a Scot. He, of course, feeds into John Stuart Mill. And it's Stewart, in his account of Adam Smith, very much reiterates and underscores, I would say, and emphasizes this liberal talk, using terms like this. So he's like keeping that ball rolling. He's advancing that ball. And then in all of his teaching with all these important students, he was really a big deal in his age. He's quite forgotten now. But he was a very, very big deal in the modern Athens, as they called it, of Edinburgh. And Hayek, here I want to emphasize this part of the quote, says, the further intellectual development, this is after Smith and a few years later, was guided largely by a group of disciples of the Scottish moral philosophers who gathered around the Edinburgh Review. And this is, again, something which I didn't know much about before coming to this study. I don't think, people like me know much about, really. Generally speaking, I mean, my peers and stuff. But it's quite interesting. And these guys, these are all Dugald Stewart's students. And Dugald Stewart is said to have exercised a dominant influence over the reviewers in launching them when they were young. And these guys in this journal, again, talk liberal. So this is from 1802 straight through. As this author puts it, Jeffrey, the editor, saw the middle class as the heart of the nation and the cutting edge of progress. He's quoting Jeffrey here, The example of the middle classes descends by degrees to the ranks immediately below them, and the general prevalence of just and liberal sentiments are thus spread by contagion through every order of society. That's from 1803, and as I say, the journal has consistently this kind of liberal talk through it. This is kind of a final touch. This guy was a major economist. He was a Scot. He was from Edinburgh. He's arguably the first professional economist when he becomes a political economy professor in London. And in 1824, he publishes this work as well as others, where this political use of liberal in this way exactly is extremely strong and repeated. And this, I think, is particularly noteworthy. Conclusions. Hayek was basically right, the importation idea basically wrong, though it does alert us to how liberal in English was affected by continental usage. I do believe that that continental experience of the liberals and the people who use that term does filter back into England, and those other ideas associated with the term. If you're familiar with Benjamin Constant's distinction between ancient liberty and modern liberty, how the ancient liberty, that is to say political participation idea of liberty, how that becomes more prominent from the continental experience then back perhaps then into Britain. Not that the Brits were devoid of that, and not that the Edinburgh Review was devoid of that, but that continental experience probably certainly strengthened that. I can't really say how much. Anyway, basically the importation theory, I would say, is wrong. The investigation establishes that the inceptive meaning of liberal in a political sense was Smith's natural liberty. Because Smith was certainly not a big promoter of democracy and ancient liberty, so to speak. That was not his concern. There's a debate about how much that fits Smith and how much that's implied in Smith and what Smith would be like today, but it's certainly not there explicitly. So I think the investigation bolsters the effort to reclaim liberal and liberalism, and it expands the debate over Adam Smith to the whole question, because there's a big debate about Smith, sort of what he would map to in modern today's political camps, as it were. And it expands that, I think, to the whole question of what it means to be a liberal. Because in a sense, we're all agreeing, we all want to claim Smith, it seems, and if we can all agree that he's the original liberal, then we're talking about what liberalism is. So I think that's a very healthy way to approach it. It's good to have Smith in the center of the conversation, I think. Those are my remarks. I hope I haven't gone too long, and I look forward to whatever's coming next. Thanks. So, what's next?
So, thank you so much, Dan, for a very interesting and informative talk, I must say. I think you said at some point that you don't know a lot about this, some aspects of it, and I can guarantee you that I know even less. So, but I think you show without much doubt that Adam Smith and Robertson and the other Scots were the most important reasons for the spread of the terms liberal and liberalism, I guess, as well, in the political meaning of the word, that is. And as you mentioned, in Sweden, the term was perhaps first used in its political sense by Georg Adelsparre, I guess we would say in Swedish, and also by the other insurgents and the Swedish revolutionaries who helped dethrone our King Gustav IV Adolphus, I guess you would say in English, in 1809. But as I was sort of preparing this comment, I was thinking a lot about what these Swedish revolutionaries, the liberal Swedish revolutionaries, what they actually wanted to achieve and what liberalism actually meant to them. And I know that I thought it was a very good handout that Lotta, kudos to you for helping to translate everything with various quotes from Johan Norberg's book on Swedish liberalism. But I noticed that it lacked, on page 62, which is quite heavily quoted, a quote by Norberg of this guy named Arthur Thomson, where he says what these Swedish revolutionaries meant by the term liberalism. No, I mean, it wasn't a Norberg quote, so it's understandable. But he says, and this is my translation, it's a lot worse than Lotta's. So, politically, liberalism meant a constitutional polity based on public opinion and a division of powers to guarantee civil freedoms and a representation on another basis than class difference. Socially, it meant removal of privileges, and economically arguing for economic freedom or the principle of free competition. And this to me seems like a rather broad definition in the sense of liberalism, where political representation is at least sort of alluded to, it appears, and this is already in 1809. So I was wondering, do you think that did this come from Smith at all? Can you derive that sort of from his idea of natural liberty, or is it the Continental influence instead?
Do you want me to answer that now?
Sure, if you like. Yeah, it's up to you.
My brief answer is that it's something else. It's perhaps kin. There's an affinity, but it's something else. It's not something that Smith propounds. And in fact, Dugald Stewart has a sentence in his account of Smith and Smith's ideas where he makes a point of separating these. So I would say that's more the other idea. It's more of the Continental idea. That's again not to say that it's not part of this British line at all. It's a question of proportions, heavier on the continent, and I would say it is a kind of separate thing.
Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to clarify that because I think I read this in your sort of abstract, or maybe it was sort of a small just summary, that Smith's meaning of liberal was laissez-faire or natural liberty. I think you used both words, and that not democracy, not political participation, and not state distribution or redistribution. And well, then apparently in Sweden already in 1809 it was in a sense more than that.
Okay.
I guess.
Okay, that's a fair point.
But also I was thinking about sort of looking at Smith's own writings, and I guess this sort of relates to the idea of who owns Smith. Would he himself have sort of passed for a liberal in what you would claim to be the sort of Smithian sense? Even, I mean, he does argue in certain parts of his writings that, for example, for state involvement to help give poor children a decent education, for example. I mean, he argues for a lot of market involvement in that as well, obviously, but still, it sounds to me that that's sort of a state well, it's a type of redistribution, I guess, and I guess you could argue that to some extent the term had already sort of deteriorated with Smith in that sense, I guess. Do you follow my sort of...
What term deteriorated?
The liberal term. I mean, if you consider that to be a part of his sort of liberal vision, then it doesn't seem quite as clear-cut that it would be the whole idea of sort of solely about natural liberty and...
Yeah. Right. I'd say the answer to that question is complicated. It's a very fair question, and it is a question of proportions. It is a question also of how you read Smith and his exceptions.
Sure. I'm in your camp, by the way, on that. So.
Yeah. I mean, even the education example that you bring up, he certainly countenances, and you could even say endorses, perhaps, what was status quo, local, partial support for a local school building and master, part of a master, not more than half of his pay.
Oh yeah, that's right.
So it's pretty minimal, but then again, if you read the last sentence in The Wealth of Nations about education, he says, but you know what, perhaps it would be better if it was entirely voluntary. And so even on that example, there's this hedging and going back and forth, and that's all part of how you read Smith on that. But you make a very fair point. You know, that was the press that you were quoting from. That was the advertisement for this talk.
Oh yeah.
It's
okay.
not going to be the abstract of the
No,
talk
okay,
when
okay.
it's when it's a real piece of research. But but yeah, you're right.
Okay, good. But I mean, I definitely agree with you that the sort of distinction between what I would, I guess, to some extent call economic and political liberty, or economic and political freedom, is a very important one. I mean, if you consider the empirical evidence in econometric studies, it's been established basically that there is a causal connection between the two, but that economic freedom causes political freedom, not the other way around. And how does it do that? Well, it's through basically the mechanism of higher incomes. Economic freedom makes you richer, and once people get sufficiently rich, they sort of can afford the sort of relative luxury of actually sort of caring about political representation or democracy. That's the way I sort of see it as at least. You could also argue that possibly they get spoiled and ungrateful to this sort of benevolent dictator who gave them this economic liberty. But I think that fact could possibly help explain sort of the move towards a broader conception of liberalism as well over sort of the course of the following 200 years, in the sense that you get sort of above the sort of minimum sufficiency level, and then you can start focusing on other things. What do you?
Yeah, there's something to that, and I agree. The two parts, as it were, are there. Although I wouldn't say they're really there right in Smith,
No.
but they're there early.
Yeah.
Like you say about in Sweden, and I would even say in Scotland soon after Smith. But look, it's one thing to say there are two parts and their proportions, but it's another thing to go forward and say that, the one starts trumping the other really significantly. Because, what does liberal mean to the average American? It means a Democrat.
Yeah.
And that's look at the opinions. I mean, not that the Republicans are that much better on these issues, but you get the idea that, they're very interventionist. I mean, it's not just about political participation, it's about all sorts of restrictions, right? And managing so-called correcting market failures.
Yeah.
That's not just democracy, so to speak. So,
but should it, because that's sort of what I didn't quite grasp, should it be democracy, in a sense? Should that be a part of liberalism, or should we really go back to...
I think it should, no, I don't think it should be so central. I think
Okay.
the liberty part should be more central, and we have bounds on democracy is, of course, the necessary way to handle democracy. I mean, you've got to have democracy, but you've got to have bounds on it, right? We don't
Sure. But in that respect, I think it's kind of interesting. At least I read some stuff by Håkan Holmberg. I don't know if you know him, but he was sort of a critic of Johan's book when it came out, because he thought it focused too much on sort of too narrowly, in a sense, on economic liberties, I guess. And in his view, most traditional liberal parties since at least the second half of the 19th century have been formed basically in order to democratize. That's been sort of their raison d'être, if you like. And it feels like this is certainly the case for most liberal parties throughout Eastern Europe or Asia and Africa as well, I guess. And in my view, it feels like, is this the wrong emphasis? I mean,
yes, it's the wrong emphasis.
Okay.
People should emphasize liberty.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting, because if that, in that case, I mean, if we say, and this I'm stealing this straight off from Holmberg, if we say that democracy is sort of a limited interest for liberalism, it's sort of not the most important facet, then does that mean that, and now I'm pushing things a bit, but does that mean that, say, Chiang Kai-shek is a better or more liberal person than Barack Obama, for example, the South Korean guy who, well, he was certainly not a Democrat, but he introduced, he laid the foundation for market reform.
those kind of questions are pertinent, and
Yeah.
you could ask, what's more liberal? and or freer.
Yeah. Yeah, but
You know,
'cause I mean,
India or Singapore.
yeah, because but I mean, you shouldn't discount that part of it. I'm not saying that it wasn't very important for South Koreans to be economically liberal, just as the same thing.
And the word economic isn't really.
Possibly not the best.
No, I
one,
mean
yeah.
it's individual liberty. It's
Yeah.
you know, economic in the broad sense of just everything, I guess. But otherwise, it's just individual liberty.
No, true.
It's not, you know, free church. You know, whatever you're making your choices about.
Sure, certainly. No. But just to go back to sort of the another sort of, from my perspective, why did like liberalism, the concept, expand? First, I was thinking about sort of the late 19th century liberals, in a sense. I mean, they faced competition with the socialists, and one sort of generous interpretation of why they became more sort of leftish themselves, I guess, could be that they felt that it was necessary to show that the market economy could, in fact, coexist sort of with social welfare measures in order to help those people who you perceived could not sort of survive or whatever on the free market. And similarly with the people in the early the liberals in the early 20th century, possibly John Maynard Keynes or Sweden's Bertil Ohlin, that you have these totalitarian regimes all over Europe, and you feel like, okay, we need to start propagating some, like, okay, we need to okay, we're gonna go the interventionist liberal way rather than the other way, just to at least sort of not make, to at least slow down, in a sense, the sort of
a compromise almost.
Yeah, I guess. So it feels like you need to see that development in that context, I guess.
Yeah, that's the big question of why does the tide turn
Yeah.
after 1880, as it were. And I don't have a simple answer to that. Democracy, I think, is a huge part of that. I mean, just in terms of universal suffrage.
Sure. I mean, it has been shown that, for example, expansion to female suffrage, basically, in the US at least, basically expanded the size of the state. So.
Yeah, those ideas went hand in hand. I mean, it became more and more like, well, now that everybody's represented, it's all voluntary. You know, it's all got the general will or the consent of the people. So now when you restrict things, put a minimum wage on, raise taxes, whatever the case may be, there's what I consider a superficial argument about now it becomes voluntary.
Yeah, okay, because it's a sort of a social contract
Yes,
thing.
exactly.
Yeah. Okay. But that being said, do you and this is sort of my final. I'm gonna skip some of my smaller thoughts, but my sort of final thinking about sort of the idea that I mean, in the sort of broader liberal debate, there is this pretty broad agreement, as far as I see it, that the principles that you disagree or argue about, like whatever it may be, that it should still be universally applicable. And I mean, back in the 1880s, when possibly the ideas, the liberal ideas were possibly, or before that, were possibly more classically liberal or whatever, but they sort of, who were the people who actually got to enjoy sort of any type of liberty, whether political or economical, well, basically was sort of a bunch of rich guys in Europe and rich white guys in Europe and the US. And I mean, since then we've expanded liberty. At the same time, maybe the meaning has moved further leftwards, but to me at least it feels like the net, the aggregate liberty is still stronger today than it was before 1880.
Worldwide, yeah, I don't know exactly how to do those metrics, but yeah,
no.
median human being on the globe.
Exactly.
I could go along with that, sure.
Yeah, okay.
And you're right, of course, that, you know, men versus women and slavery and couple big things, right?
Yeah.
So, sure.
And then from a classical liberal perspective, I guess there are trade-offs to that, but well, I feel like I'm ready to take those trade-offs in a sense. I mean,
sure.
Yeah. But yeah, okay. Thank you for this. No, I think this is very interesting, and I wonder when do you think this will be ready, the paper version?
I hope within a few months.
Okay, I'm looking forward to it. I wish you good luck.
Thanks very much for your feedback.
Thank you.
So we're good. Carl, what are we doing now? Certainly, yes. Joram.
John, or at that time, Preußen, are there no influence or vice versa from Germany? And,
Oh, you're going to be asked to repeat that question.
Yes,
Can you
for
do
the
that?
recording, please use the microphone.
so,
Den är grön. Go ahead.
Göran, my name, important at that time, of growing importance, I mean Prussia and later Germany in the 19th century, and Italy, and also maybe the tradition from Austria, you know, Miles and all these guys. There must have been schools and at those places, and we haven't mentioned them today with a single word.
Well, I'm chiefly concerned with the origination of the term liberal in a political sense, and we do have the German corpus here, so we do have this evidence that the German usage of liberal in a political way follows, with some considerable lag, the British. What was it that you thought might pertain?
Just a thought, if there's any name or well-known scientist from Germany or Italy or Prussia to be mentioned in this context.
Yeah, I don't, that's a good question. You know, when I think about these years in Germany and liberalism, I think of Wilhelm von Humboldt.
Okay.
I don't know that he used the term liberal. He wrote his very liberal work, I believe it was 1791. I don't think it was published till sometime after. Isn't that right? It was, but so even if he did use liberal, it still could conceivably be importing from the Brits. I don't know what else. Yeah. Sure. Thank you.
Who's next? There were a couple of hands, yeah?
I'm just interested more methodologically here. It seems like this is very bumpy when it comes to the German side, and is the corpus much smaller for these other countries? Could you give some, because my impression is that the corpus of your English text is much, much, much bigger than the corpus of these other countries, but I don't get a sense of it from the data. How extensive is this Google corpus for these other countries, and how good is the coverage when you come back in?
That's a good question. Here's the English, and this is they're both with 1 year of smoothing. Otherwise, if I did 0 years of smoothing, it's even sharper. Yeah. The default, by the way, is 3 years of smoothing. So I changed it to 1 to get it more accurate. You're probably right, and I mean, you may well be right that the corpus is smaller in, say, Germany, perhaps because fewer books were published in Germany, or perhaps because Google is still getting around to it.
Yes, a little bit like this bump there for 70, 80 there, which I'm a little bit like interested in. For example, it might be, is that just a smaller corpus, or could we see a completely different picture if there were a bigger corpus there?
Well, this could be literally, this is, what color is that?
Liberal ideas.
Yeah,
right?
it looks like liberal ideas. That could literally be 1 or 2 occurrences. And you know what else I find is a possibility and sometimes screws up this whole thing? Is that a work from 1780 gets reprinted in 1955, and there's an introduction, and the editor in the introduction says liberal ideas, and it goes into this as a 1780 occurrence of liberal ideas. That does happen. And that that does happen. I mean, it's not rampant, so I don't think it's destroying, you know, the general thrust of all this by any means. And Mark Davies, I'm sure, he would be a good person to talk to more about this, and I intend to, because he would know all about it. But I don't know what's going on there. And, you know, even if it is just some guy in 1780 saying that, that's still 11 years after Robertson. I mean, so it's just one or two guys. I mean, that's really little.
It's also, this is the quantity of the in the total amount of books, right? For every year.
Yes. Well, it's not of books. It's actually of
published,
words.
published works. Yeah,
Actually,
it could be scientific work and
Yeah,
text and
scanned-
newspapers and
The words of scanned books. That's what that percentage is of, for a single word. Or these are actually two words. This is called a 2 gram, which is a specific case of an n-gram. This is a 2 gram. And so what you got there is the percentage of all 2 grams that are this 2 gram.
Is there some possibility of seeing the different types of sources here?
Oh yeah.
Like I'm interested in seeing, especially like if they're like political text here or
Absolutely.
certain types
You can drill in.
you could
It's all there. It's all the data. It's all.
that would be interesting to
When you do this on the viewer, they give you this table down here, and you can pick the years and the terms for these 6 terms. So you can drill straight to the usages.
Yeah, I think that would be very interesting to see a bit more about, especially in what types of.
I'll let you want to go to tonight. Yeah, thank you. Any other
more
questions?
questions?
Lars, do you have a question? You need the mic if you do. This is Lars Udin from Stockholm University Sociology Department.
Well, actually, I didn't have any question. I think it was very convincing case you made for this story, and I never had any other idea myself. But you could think about, I mean, the importance of this semantics. I mean, there was a philosopher who wrote an article in 1959. His name was Galli, and he said that the terms like liberal, like freedom, like justice, like democracy are essentially contested, and there will never be people will never agree to them because various camps will try to adopt them for their own purposes, and then because they have a positive valence, so to speak. Even if I think you're right. This is at least an original meaning of liberal. I agree with that, but it's one.
All right. Well, thank you for the comment. Yeah. I do think that over time the power balance of the different camps changes, and there's sort of a broad story there to think about.
There is a conceptual drift, I mean, which is inevitable.
Yeah. I think of it as a broad 100-year, 200-year story, and this idea of like cycles every 20 years or something. I don't think that's seeing the big picture. I think we're in deeper trouble than that. Yes, Michael.
I got a real short question. Back to your first slide.
Very first?
I think it was almost the very first slide. And that was Rachel Maddow.
Oh, okay.
And why do you think she is so insistent on labeling and categorizing herself as liberal? Because she really does, as you point out. You know, she would. There's almost not a program where she doesn't point out liberal that she is, and all the other good people.
Well, just
are
like
liberal.
Professor Udin just said, there's a positive valence to these terms, and I think particularly to liberal. And I think it's very unfortunate that folks like this sort of support their claim to that vital term, which goes back to generous, right?
Or at least good.
Oh yeah, generous, and yeah. And then to liberty, to liberalization. So it's it's a very valuable thing to be able to call yourself a liberal. I mean, how does someone who is accepted as the liberal lose? I mean, so I think it was a catastrophe what happened over 100 years ago, in terms of the shift of the words and what they came to mean, and we're still reeling from it. So I'm not surprised that she does that, and all of you know, the folks of all of her friends and people like her do that. They have a tremendous advantage being able to call themselves liberal, as I see it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does, and at least you'd think it does to the already converted. The question, I think, is the way she uses it, that it sort of goes into generalized goodness, motherhood and apple pie. And
Yeah.
it sets it up for the Sean Hannitys of the world to smear. And I mean, it's almost as bad as communist, right? So in a way, I think there's a danger that if you use it too much as equal to goodness, you drain it from definitely original content,
Yeah.
but also common
Yeah,
content.
yeah, that's right. To some extent, the loss of those meanings is just a watering down, a confusion. It's not a specific change from X to Y. It's just a loss of X. You know, this is going to be recorded, so maybe someone will watch this video, and maybe you guys will be powerful players in the culture someday. But I think, you know, wherever you are, and you're not happy about her ideas and her calling herself a liberal, I think you shouldn't call her a liberal, or Paul Krugman a liberal. You could try social democrat. Swedes would know what you're talking about. Or you could say left liberal. That at least distinguishes, it modifies the liberal at least, and it puts left on there. Left they can have, okay? That's okay. I mean, I'm not that I'm right or something, but I don't want left, and left's never had a venerable thing about it or anything. It's a 20th century term, so nothing good came out of that century. So I would say, you know, say left liberal, or even, I don't know, it's a little bit strong in America to say the leftist, to just say left, because I mean, she's a Democrat. I mean, it's all code for Democrat. So just call her a leftist is a little strong, but you could perhaps say left liberal, like, you know, when talking about her. That would be a good improvement, I think. Any other questions? Okay.
Sorry.
Sure.
What should we call these guys?
Do you need the microphone?
What should we call these guys then? Goldberg and Hannity?
That's a good question. This gets into the question of, you know, is conservative a narrow term or a broad term? They like to make it a broad term. I like to make it a narrow term, which excludes me. But you could say Republicans.
Yeah, possibly.
I don't know. Yeah. I mean, like I say, this is all code, so it might be best to avoid the code in a way. And it's not just code, of course, and you can't always just translate it as shown there. But a lot of times you can, and that works really well. That's very definite, and it doesn't have any necessary. It has valence to people in different ways, so it's more open and candid about that.
Okay, I suggest we give Dan a big hand again. Thank
Thank
you all for
you.
coming.